For the final presentation of this semester, Miles is going to talk to us about making the trials unit work for us. He was meant to give this presentation earlier in the year, but unfortunately he's very clumsy. Whilst out running, fell over and smashed his shoulder. I met him in Perth on Sunday, and he's back running, I'm pleased to say. He finished the Tay 10. There's a very flattering photo, which I have not shared with you, but might do at the end. And he's shared with me a few niggles and a few tweaks, but I think he's fit enough now to give us his presentation, making the trials unit work for you. Thank you, Miles.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's lovely to be back. It's lovely to be out of a sling and with you here today. Sadly, it was skiing rather than running, and it was slightly more dramatic than Tom made it sound, in that I was obviously skiing very fast indeed and bounced down a mountain several times. I'm very pleased that Tom put that picture up rather than the one of me running on Saturday, however. So I want to talk to you about Tayside Clinical Trials Unit. I became a co-director of the Trials Unit in October last year, along with Peter Donnan and Fiona Hogarth. And my brief really is to provide a clinical perspective to the Trials Unit and provide an interface between the activity of the Trials Unit and local investigators, as well as investigators around the country. So I want to just briefly outline to you what a trials unit is and why Tayside needs a trials unit, tell you a little bit about how we fit in with some of the other research landscape within Tayside, give you a brief outline and some examples of the sort of services that Tayside Clinical Trials Unit can offer, give you some pointers and some thoughts on how we can help you build a better trial, give you one or two ideas about how you can work with us to provide a better trial, and give you a little flavour about where we're hoping to go in the future, because like all things, we are, of course, a work in progress. So this is what Wikipedia says about a trials unit, which I didn't think was too bad. It's a specialised biomedical research unit, designs, centrally coordinates and analyses clinical trials and other studies. So that gives you a very broad idea about what we do, and I'll give you some specific examples to illustrate that. Tayside Clinical Trials Unit is quite a young trials unit. We were actually founded in about 2008 to 9 as a direct response to an MHRA inspection. The research landscape and the regulatory landscape had been changing quite rapidly throughout the 2000s. That kind of caught up with this university and this health board in quite a big way towards the end of the 2000s. And faced with an impending MHRA inspection, it was clear that we had to move quite rapidly to get our house in order and demonstrate that we had an appropriate regulatory environment for conducting clinical trials. And the trials unit was really born out of that necessity. And since then it has been evolving to take on an expanded set of competencies to deliver different types of trials. And now we've reached a point in our evolution where it's time to take stock and say, well, are we actually delivering what people want us to? Not just enough to keep the MHRA happy, but enough so that we can provide services to local and national investigators to do the types of trials that you want and the types of trials that patients and funders want us to do. So why do we need a clinical trials unit? Well, the single biggest reason is that it's difficult to run trials. Some of you will have run trials. I can see some eminent trialists at the back of the room in the shape of Dr. Mackenzie and Professor MacDonald. They have run many trials, and you can tell from Tom's grey hair just how difficult it is to run trials. And yes, it is grey, Tom, yeah. And it's hard. And the days of dabbling in trials or being an amateur running trials are very much coming to an end. It's complex, it's time-consuming, and it's extremely expensive to run trials, and it's becoming more expensive. So you need specialist expertise to run trials, even relatively small trials nowadays. The bar is getting higher in terms of quality. Initiatives such as the Consort initiative on trial conduct and reporting have ensured that you really can't get away with inadequate design or inadequate execution because you're not going to get published, or if you do get published, you won't get published anywhere decent, and nobody will take any notice of the results. So the need for high quality in trials is there as never before. The regulatory environment is becoming more and more demanding, not just in terms of ethics, but in terms of the demands that funders put on us, that the NHS put on us as trialists, and of course people like the MHRA who regulate drug trials. And those regulatory environments are really demanding the involvement of either a clinical trials unit or an equivalent body of expertise. And while some large groups do have that expertise, if you're a person who's not part of such a large group and you want to be involved in designing and running a trial, you need to enlist the help of a clinical trials unit. And funders demand it. It is virtually impossible to get money out of NIHR for a significant trial now without the involvement of a clinical trials unit or an equivalent body of expertise. And our personal experience within the trials unit, and also my personal experience as a trialist as well, is it's much, much easier to have a local clinical trials unit that you're engaged with rather than having to use one at the other end of the country. Communication is easier, relationships are easier, you understand the culture of the trials unit and they understand where you're coming from as an investigator. And it isn't amateur night anymore, so being frank does not cut it anymore. And thinking that MHRA stands for the Malta Hotels and Restaurants Association does not cut it anymore, because when the MHRA come knocking, as they are going to come knocking on our door later this year, we're up for another inspection, you have to demonstrate to them that you know what you're doing, you have the right systems in place, the right quality assurance mechanisms in place, and people who know what they're doing. Trials are very complex to run. This simple-looking diagram is from the NIHR. It's from their clinical trials toolkit. Each of these little things, which looks like an underground station, if you click on, it takes you into an enormous slew of documentation and further advice as to what you need to do at any point. It looks very similar, to my mind, to that. Now, I'm not a plumber, and I certainly wouldn't try and do that as an amateur. In reality, if you're a trialist, it actually feels somewhat like that. And clearly, if you're frank and you don't know what you're doing and you pull the wrong end of the piece of string, all you end up is tying yourself in knots. Because trials are complex and because they're difficult, they fail. And we have known this for many years, and this graph is actually a relatively recent graph from 2013. And what it really shows is that only about half of trials, and this in this case funded by the MRC and the NIHR in the period 2002 to 2008, only about half of the trials actually recruited the number of people that they said they needed to get an answer. More worryingly still for those of us who are trialists, giving an extension to the time didn't help. It didn't make anybody, it didn't improve the success rate. Now, we've known this for years and years and years. There were studies like this done 15 or 20 years ago. It's not actually much better now than it was 15 or 20 years ago. So we're still in a very difficult environment. You can improve your chances of success by allying yourself with the right expertise in delivering trials. So where does the trials unit within Tayside fit into the research landscape? Well, at the top here, you've got University of Dundee and NHS Tayside that collaborate in a number of different ways to create a research environment. And TASC, Tayside Academics Medical Science Centre, is the body that is there to discharge the job of making research happen within Tayside for the university and the NHS. And there are various different things within TASC. Jacob is here. Jacob will answer any difficult and awkward questions on this structure if you wish to ask him about it. But there are all of the things that you are perhaps aware of with NHS R&D Office, and I've listed some of those. So there's quality assurance, there's pharmacovigilance, there's financing, there's networks, all of those sort of things. But there are a number of other research bodies within Tayside that sit under the TASC umbrella. There's the biorepository, what we used to call the biobank. There's the imaging facility, including those that run the research MRI scanner. There's the clinical research centre that helps to actually deliver trial visits and measure outcomes. And there's the Tayside Clinical Trials Unit. So we are a part of TASK, we sit within TASK, but we don't just work for investigators within Tayside, as I'll show you later. And nationally, we are one of 57 fully accredited clinical trials units. For the first 3 years of our existence, then, we were a probationary clinical trials unit under the supervision of the Robertson Centre in Glasgow. But from 2012 onwards, we've had fully accredited trials unit status. These are where all of the trials units are around the UK. There are a few in Scotland, as you can see, but there are certainly less trials units than there are universities in Scotland. Funders expect large trials to be run by a clinical trials unit or equivalent, and the MHRA like to see a trials unit involved or equivalent in delivery of drug trials, which are known by the acronym of CTIMP. So, before I explain what we do as a trials unit, I wanted to just take a step backwards and outline one or two things that actually make for a successful trial. And I'm going to split this into two. So there's a good application. There's the planning and the design of a trial. You've got to ask the right question. Something that I think is absolutely critical as a trialist is assembling the right team. And that's one of the things when I'm designing a trial that I will do right at the beginning, is think about who I want on the team and assemble that team. Because it's actually quite difficult to disassemble a team when you've assembled it. If you suddenly decide that you've got a bunch of people who you really didn't want to work with, you have a problem. So getting the right team with the right mix of expertise is critical. Design is absolutely paramount. It doesn't matter how much money and time and effort you throw at a badly designed trial, you're never going to get it to work. So getting the design right and designing out problems is absolutely crucial. You need a well-informed sample size calculation, and you need some preliminary data if you're going to make a robust application. Now that might be qualitative work, it might be a feasibility study showing that your intervention can actually be delivered in practice. It might be a pilot trial to show that you can actually find and recruit and randomise people and that they stay in your study. It may just be something as simple as interrogating local databases to actually find out whether you've actually got any of the people you want to study. One of the tragic things that we occasionally see is people who assure us that they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that they can recruit into their trial. As soon as the trial opens, all of these people magically vanish, and they go on holiday, or they disappear, or they move down south. And there was a researcher in the US called Louis Lasagna who coined this as a central tenet of trials many years ago, and it's now known as Lasagna's law. At the end of the trial, all of those people will come back, and you will suddenly be inundated with them in clinic, and you'll wonder why on earth you couldn't find them whilst you were actually doing your trial. Trials are not cheap, and I'll come back to this later. You need adequate funding to do a trial, and if you try and do a trial without adequate funding, it makes your life very, very difficult indeed, and is a recipe for failure. So your costings need to be realistic. At the same time, there is a limit to how much a funder will actually pay. So you need to strike the correct balance there. And finally, you need collectible outcomes. You may have a marvellous idea for an intervention. You may think that this is a fantastically important illness that you're studying. You may have some brilliant ideas about the type of thing that you want to collect in terms of data. But if those data are not collectible, if the patients don't like the test, if you can't get access to the MRI scanner, then your study is going to fail. And again, that is not always straightforward. So you do your application, you put it in, the NIHR like it, or British Heart Foundation like it, they give you the money. But then you've got to deliver. And the critical thing about delivery, assuming that you've done the design right, is about having the right infrastructure to deliver. One of the things that we are, I think, very poor at, certainly within the NHS, is project management. Every day that I ever spent in the NHS, I could always find an example of disastrously bad project management. It's not something that we're taught as clinicians. It's not something that we undergo any formal training in whatsoever. But deliver any complex project, and a trial is no exception, then you need expertise in project management. Now, some of us who are trialists pick this up through bitter experience over many years, but clearly if you're not used to doing it, it is much better to obtain project management expertise from outside. You need data management infrastructure and expertise. The days, by and large, of storing some stuff on your laptop and fiddling with it in Excel are gone. There are exceptions to that, which I'll come back to later, but by and large, that is not the way to manage data nowadays. It's got to be confidential, it's got to be secure, it's got to be reproducible, it has to have audit trails, and it has to be usable by other people, and that's going to become increasingly important. You need regulatory expertise. You've seen the diagram. Navigating that regulatory maze, that big ball of string, is difficult, and you need people by your side who are used to doing it. Even those of us who do this all the time find it incredibly exasperating because it changes on a month-to-month basis. So what worked in terms of the regulators 6 months ago, it may have changed, and you cannot possibly keep up with that as a lone trialist. Financial management for these projects is sometimes complex. You've got lots of different people, universities, NHS, different universities working together, sometimes industry. You've got contracts between multiple parties, you've got agreements between multiple parties, and the financial and legal management of trials is difficult and complex, so you need expertise there. You need an environment that brings all of that expertise together, and you need a good network of professional links within the trial area. And that might be with other trialists, it might be with other content experts within your field of study. But having those networks and building those networks is important to obtain funding to deliver trials successfully as well. So here are some reasons why trials run into trouble. Wrong question. I'm going to give you a painful personal example. So we got some money, and I'll talk about the bicarb trial later. We got some money from NIHR to do a trial of bicarbonate treatment for older people with advanced CKD. That was a commissioned piece of work. The NIHR wanted it done, and we tendered to do it and got the contract. The problem is that there was a pilot trial done, and the results were available just as we were applying for the grant. They helped us greatly in getting the grant because we could demonstrate this was a promising area of study. Since then, that study has been published, widely circulated. Nephrologists have read it and decided that bicarbonate is a fabulous thing and everybody should get it. So there is no longer clinical equipoise, and lots of nephrologists just want to give bicarbonate rather than randomising people to bicarbonate or placebo. So that kind of lack of equipoise causes all sorts of trouble, and it's not an isolated example. Failure to design out bias, so poor design can hobble a trial, and it doesn't matter how good your statistical analysis plan is, you can't get around some of these biases. So high dropout rates, differential dropout rates are potential problems for trials due to failure to consider issues around design. The single biggest problem that trials have is not recruiting enough people, as I've shown you earlier. And that is the thing that keeps all trialists awake at night, is that they're not going to recruit to target. And a lot of that, unfortunately, is based around unrealistic assumptions and a lack of preliminary data. We all do it because it's not always possible to get good preliminary data. And we all do it because we're desperate for the trial to succeed and we're desperate to get the money in. But that can really hobble the success of a trial. If you think that you can recruit 100 patients in a year and you've only got the time and resources to get 30 of them in, or you can't find 100 patients a year, your trial will fail. And the corollary to that is excessive dropout rates. Great to get people into a trial, but you've got to keep them in. Now, sometimes dropout is inevitable. If you are like me, studying old, frail people in your trials, they're going to die. And they're going to come into hospital, and they're going to go into care homes, and they're going to drop out of trials. And if they don't, I've got it wrong because I'm not studying the right group of people. But high dropout rates and dropouts for less good reasons than things like death, again, can jeopardize the success of a trial and can lead to problems interpreting the results. Regulation always takes time. and it always takes at least twice as long as you thought it would. And this is a problem that we frequently come across, especially with inexperienced investigators who come and say, oh, well, I've allowed 2 months to get ethics and MHRA. Not going to work. Take you 6 months. Might take you 2 months if you're very, very lucky, but in 90% of cases it will take you much longer. Failure to actively manage problems as they arise is an issue, what you might refer to as drift. And this typically takes the form of, well, we've just started recruiting and we haven't really got many people into the trial yet. What do you think we should do? Well, I think we should just leave it for a bit because we've only just got off the ground and it might get better. So 3 months later on, you go, well, we haven't really got very many people in the trial yet. But last month was slightly better, so maybe it's now picking up. We'll leave it. 6 months in, still haven't got many people in the trial. We're going to have to do something now. And you've only got 12 months to recruit, and it's going to take you 3 months to get an amendment through ethics and MHRA and everybody else. That kind of approach to project management doesn't work. You have to actively manage problems as they arrive, and you have to be jumping on these problems and not letting them drift. Lack of resource for data management, for statistics, for other aspects of the trial. If you haven't got enough personnel and enough time on the problem, then you are going to struggle to cope. And there is a limit to the amount of time that you have as an investigator or a trialist. And a lack of expertise often underpins some of these issues. And finally, I've just flagged this up. We have personal experience within the trials unit of this on occasion. Dysfunctional teams that won't talk to each other. Investigators that won't talk to the trials unit, investigators that won't talk to each other, can cause real problems and stop decisions being made that allow the correct conduct of a trial. So, what can the trials unit do about all of those issues? Well, here is a list of what we can give as a trials unit. We can help you with trial design. Not everybody needs that help. If you're an experienced trialist, you're perfectly capable of designing your own trial. If you're not an experienced trialist, we can help. That can include things like what pathway your patient is going to take through in terms of recruitment, screening, baseline visits, what's going to happen to them. Recruitment strategies. Are you going to get people from primary care, secondary care? How are you going to approach them? Advertising, social media. Help with statistics and sample size calculation, and both of those things, because they're pre-application, are free. Come and talk to us early, and we will provide those services. We will help with costing the application, and that is not straightforward. We can provide project management and project problem solving, regulatory approval help, randomization services in collaboration with Health Informatics Centre, drug management. We've got an innovative system for doing that called the Trust Suite. MHRA were very impressed by that when they came a couple of years ago. We can help you with communications and with dissemination, things like a web portal for your trial, to advertise it, to manage your collaborators, study documentation design and development. We continue to learn quite a lot about that in a short space of time in the trials unit. The way that we used to design documentation, very different from what we do now. I think we've learned a lot of lessons about streamlining that, making it harder to make errors on your documentation, making it easier to put data into databases. I've got the data management team. I can see them in the front row grinning at me at the moment, hoping that I don't sort of flag up who they are. But Emma is there and her team. They will help with design of case record forms, building your database, data entry, cleaning data, extracting data. And Peter Donnan heads up the statistics team that will not only analyse the trial main outcomes, but will help with preparing things like data monitoring committee reports. And you don't want to do all of that work and then just have it published in a scientific paper. That is not adequate nowadays. It needs proper publicity and dissemination through multiple channels to patients, to policymakers, to the public, as well as to academics and health service providers, and we can help with all of that. So some of those things are free, pre-award. Some of those things are not free, and I'll come on to where we get our money from in a minute, perhaps. We are not fussy as a trials unit. I was going to say we are promiscuous as a trials unit, but that probably isn't the right word to use. Some trials units will only support cancer trials. Some trials units will only support certain types of interventions, such as complex interventions or non-drug trials. We are happy to support any type of trial from anybody, from phase 1 through to phase 4. We do trials on drugs, we do trials on vitamins, we do trials on complex interventions, such as exercise-type interventions. And we do 1 or 2 studies that are not trials at all. They're observational studies, but usually multi-centre, complex studies where perhaps a lot of complex data is involved or complex project management is required. We support commercial and non-commercial studies, and the degree to which we support commercial studies is quite variable. So sometimes we're providing just 1 or 2 services, such as data management or statistics, but sometimes we're project managing these studies as well. Most of the studies that we run are sponsored by University of Dundee and NHS Tayside, but we are now running some externally sponsored studies as well. Brings its own challenges, but it's useful to get a different perspective on how other people operate across the UK. So there is no one-size-fits-all to trials, and there's no one-size-fits-all to investigators. And so the services that we provide are very much mix and match. If you just want stats, that's fine. If you want a full suite of support, including project management, that's also fine. Clearly, one costs more than the other, and what you need will depend in part on your experience, but also in part on who your funder is and what they are prepared to fund and what their funding envelope is. So just to give you a bit of a rundown on what we're doing at the moment, we've currently got 30 studies on the books. It might be 31 now, actually, looking from yesterday. About half of those are CTIMPs, so they're drug trials. And the range is enormous in terms of size. We do run a number of small single-centre trials with less than 100 people. The biggest trial I think we've got on the books at the moment is the Eccles trial, which is aiming for 12,000 people and is getting quite close to that now. At the moment, we are assisting with the delivery of around £3 million a year worth of grant funding for trials, and our turnover or our income as a trials unit is less than a quarter of that. We get a little bit of funding from the Scottish Government through the CSO for some core staff, but many of the staff that are employed in the trials unit are employed on grants, so there'll be specific funding for a chunk of statistician time or data manager time, specific funding for a trials manager for that particular grant or for part of a trials manager. Here is the Board of Fame. If you see your picture up there, then give us a wave. If you think your picture should be up there and it isn't, then I do apologise. There was a limit to the amount of time I had to cut and paste all of these pictures on there. But you can see, I think, from this that there's quite a broad range of specialties who are working with us in the trials unit at the moment, from primary care to cardiovascular to hepatology, surgery, psychiatry, and dentistry and nursing as well. So, a couple of examples. I've talked a bit about the bicarb trial, and this is just really to give you an idea about what the trials unit does on a trial. So, this, as I said, it's an NIHR-funded trial. We're recruiting from 25 sites across the UK. We're looking to get just under 400 patients. So the trials unit for this particular trial provides really sort of full-featured support. We have a full-time project manager, trials manager. We have some senior trials manager time as well. Randomisation system, study drug management system, which tracks drugs across all the sites in the UK, helps with the dispensing and captures the number of medications actually taken when they're returned. We've got CRF and electronic data capture and data management, and the database is housed within the clinical trials unit. Generation of statistical analyses and DMC reports is done by the trials unit, and maintenance of the website is also done. And to do that, then that requires a study team. So there are 8 of us as co-investigators, and I'm the lead investigator. We have a full-time trial manager paid from the grant. We have a small amount of senior trial managers' time to support them. we have statistician time, data manager time, and a little bit of time for other costs associated with maintaining the data network. And then there are other services that are provided by task but don't fall within the trials unit themselves. And that includes things like trial monitoring to make sure that different sites are doing what they're supposed to, pharmacovigilance and reporting adverse events to the MHRA as they happen. Now, this is normally what happens when I put something up like that, and some colleagues will say, well, that is going to cost a fortune, I can't afford that, my BHF grant has a limit of 300k and you are asking for 290k to do all of that. That leaves me 10 pence to run the trial. And this is always a tension, and as an investigator then I recognise that tension and I suffer from it as well. Running trials is expensive, but I would argue that running trials on the cheap is a recipe for failure. And most of the major funders are fully prepared to fund costs associated with running trials properly and using trials units. Where it gets difficult is at that bottom end where we're using especially charity funders who often are much more reluctant to include a lot of these costs, and in order to provide value for money for the charities, then we often can't put in fully featured trial support. In general, for the major funders, though, you are much more likely to get your trial funded if you include realistic clinical trials unit support. I sit on the Chief Scientist's Office committee that considers a lot of trials proposals. This is a picture of us at the committee in St Andrew's House. We've just looked at an application for a clinical trial that didn't have any statistician support and wasn't supported by a trials unit. As you can see, the response is negative. It is a sign to us on a committee that people know what they're doing and they know what they're talking about if they have included those types of costs, because they recognise that they know what they're up against. But I can do that. I can do that at home. I can do that with my research nurse. I can do it on an Excel spreadsheet. And the interesting thing here is that, yes, you can for some trials, and that's absolutely fine. And we've had extensive conversations locally with the MHRA about the need for expensive data management for relatively small trials, and they've indicated you can do it on an Excel spreadsheet as long as that spreadsheet functionality is done according to very strict protocols. There is an audit trail, it is properly protected, and it's not just sitting on your laptop at home. In general, though, that is a relatively high-risk strategy. There are risks around data security and quality and credibility of your trial. You will still have to end up doing the regulatory side, and that is hard work if you are doing it all as an investigator or trying to get your research nurse to do it. And things are getting worse, not better. You can't do a trial now without a detailed protocol. When I started doing trials 15 years ago, a protocol was 3 pages long. Now a protocol is sort of a minimum of 20 pages and often 50 pages. You can't really do a trial now without statistical analysis plan prior to data lock. And if you want to get your trial published in a good journal, they will expect to see a statistical analysis plan. You're soon going to need a plan for data sharing and open access. It is no good from now on, really, having a trial where you keep the data. It is going to need to be made publicly available in a controlled way, but for anybody who has a legitimate interest in that raw data to look at it, reanalyze it, combine it with other data. That is the way things are going, so you need a plan and you need a mechanism to make that happen. And the final thing I've put up here is an example of how the research landscape is changing, is that patient and public involvement in design and running trials is now becoming essential. Again, for NIHR trials, like HTA trials, it's mandatory. There are huge chunks of how you have involved patients and the public in the design of the trial. You get brownie points on the committee if you have actually got members of the public or patients as co-investigators on the trial. So not just on your trial steering committee, but actually on the grant. And that is becoming more and more common as well. So all of that added complexity means it's getting harder and harder and harder for people to do trials in small groups with minimal support. So here's example 2, just to show that you can still do single-centre trials, and you can do it without the fully featured support, but there's still a role for us as a trial unit in supporting this kind of work. So Alfie is a trial that Jacob is running. I'm a co-applicant on it, and it's a single-centre trial of allopurinol versus placebo to improve muscle function in older people. It's charity funded, 300k limit, so we've got 290 or something like that, I think. We're looking for 120 patients, and we're doing MR spectroscopy and vascular function tests as the main outcomes. And clearly for that amount of money, there's a limit to the amount of support a trials unit can give you. So there's a small amount of money in there for project management support. There is money in there for randomisation and help with study drug management. The trials unit has given some help with designing the case record form and will be giving help with statistical analysis. But the research fellow on the project manages the data entry, a lot of the regulatory side of things, and does the day-to-day project management, supported by the team in the trials unit. And this is an example of a trial where we are actually using Excel according to task SOPs in a controlled fashion to manage the data. Here are some other selected examples just to give you an idea about the range and breadth of work that the trials unit's involved with. So Eccles is a very large multi-centre trial looking at a blood test to detect early lung cancer. That's co-funded by an industrial partner. It's getting pretty close to recruiting its target of 12,000 patients. I think young Dr. Farden has had some engagement with this, amongst others. Adduce is just coming to an end, and that's an example of a study that's not a trial. It's an observational study of the long-term effects, psychiatric and cardiovascular effects of treatments for ADHD that's running in multiple centres across Europe. Viaduct is one of John Dillon's trials in hepatitis C, and that's a multi-centre pilot trial of vitamin D as an adjunctive therapy that the CSO have funded. And Stacked is an example of a trial where we are delivering the trial for an external sponsor. So the University of Nottingham is the sponsor, and the lead investigator is from the University of Nottingham, but we are providing trials management and support for the trial, and that's co-funded by AstraZeneca and Cancer Research UK, amongst others. So you can see from that there are lots of different types of trial across lots of different disease areas, different models of how we can actually support that work. So we can help you design the trial, we can help you to make sure your costs are realistic, we can help you get those regulatory approvals, we can help you manage your trial, project manage your trial to make sure that it works. It takes a huge amount of work off your back and helps to ensure quality. We can help you do things like sort out how you're going to manage samples from across the UK, how you're going to import results from different labs. We can then manage that data in a secure way in a single place, and then we can help you manage the analyses and the outputs as well. And all of that means that you won't kill yourself when you try to deliver a trial, because it is extremely hard work. So, I want to finish just by saying how you can help us to help you. I'm keen to go out and talk to as many investigators as I can. Those of you who are active trialists, those of you who might want to do trials in the future. I've managed to get round to some of you to canvass your opinions already, and I'm keen to talk to as many people as possible, because I want us to be in a position where we can deliver to you as trialists and as investigators what you want. Our service has to be something you want, not something that we want and that you have to put up with. One thing that's really helpful, though, is to talk to people very early on in the course of designing a trial. Typically what happens when you want to do a trial is that you go to the pub with a couple of mates and somebody goes, wouldn't it be a good idea if we did blah? And then after about 5 minutes, most of the thinking for the trial is actually done and most of the key components are in place on the back of a beer mat, and it all springs from there. Ideally, we'd like to talk to you during those first 5 minutes, so invite us to the pub and let's get talking. Because the earlier we're embedded in that process, then the easier it is for us to give you advice and support around design, and we end up with a product, a trial that is actually deliverable. It doesn't cost any more or less than we agreed it was going to cost. The timelines are realistic. The amount of support you've got is realistic, and we all understand each other. And good trial applications usually need preliminary work, so come and talk to us about the steps before the main trial, about the feasibility study, about the qualitative work, about scoping out whether the patients are actually out there, because that can be extremely helpful. We want to help you with costs. Helping you with costs does take a bit of time, so please come and talk to us a bit earlier than 48 hours before the grant deadline. Because the earlier it is, the more scope there is for negotiating and the more scope there is for coming up with something that's right for us as a trials unit and right for you when you're putting things into the funder. And finally, please tell us about problems. Some of you are excellent about telling me about problems, and I'm very used to listening to that, and that's good. I need that feedback. But if you're running a trial, don't hide problems from the trials unit. Come and talk to the trials unit about problems you're having running the trial, because only then are we in a position to actually do something about it. Some of you won't be interested in running a trial, and that's fine. Life is short. You might just want to recruit a few patients into a trial run from elsewhere. That's good. Please do. Go and talk to NHS R&D people about that. Commercial if it's a commercial trial, non-commercial otherwise. They can help you become a recruiting site for other people's trials that will almost certainly be run from another trials unit elsewhere. And you might want to talk to the Clinical Research Centre guys as well to get the local support you need to actually deliver on that trial. So where do we go from here? Well, I want us to be engaged early in the process of trial design as a trials unit. I want us to develop a more transparent approach to costing for investigators. I'm listening to the feedback. You're telling me that is an issue. I want us to be active in developing patient and public involvement panels. Some areas of research within Tayside are quite good at this. Other areas it's deficient. We need to be doing much more of this so that we don't have to scramble to get patient and public involvement when we've decided that we're going to put in an application. I want us in the trials unit to do research about research. There is a danger that looks as though I'm disappearing up my own colon, but I think that's a good thing to do for two reasons. Firstly, it adds value to the work that the university does. Secondly, it means that we're able to deliver a better product because we're able to deliver more efficient trials. I want us to be better, faster, cheaper. So it's about quality, it's about timeliness, and it's about giving best value for money. And if we can do those three things, then that makes us more attractive to you as investigators and to funders as well. And clearly, in order to do those things, we need to develop metrics of success. And that's something that trials units really are in the infancy of doing. There's a bit of chat around the UK about that, but very, very few units actually publish any kind of metrics of success. So please come and talk to us. These funders have already talked to us. They are the people that are currently funding the trials that are going on within the trials unit. I hope I haven't missed anybody out, but that's a fair selection of them. I'm interested in what you want to tell me, and I hope to get around to talking to as many people as possible about the work of the trials unit and how we can help you better over the next few months. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miles. This is part one of a two-part programme of talks. The second one being...
It's something to do with task, I think, more generally.
I think it's how task can help you with to deliver your research.